Just a little reflection on the parasha Yitro. When Jethro says, "Now I know," this is reflected in what Moses says a little later in Deuteronomy chapter 4. He says, this is Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 5. "See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. See, so keep and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples." And remember, peoples is always synonymous with nations. "Who will hear all these statutes and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as is the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I'm setting before you today?'" It's not exactly the same, but it's similar in that the testimony of Israel would cause those in the nations to say, "There's no other God but the God of Israel." Just like Jethro, when he saw what God had done for the people of Israel, he also said, "There is no other God like the God of Israel." So, in a sense, in what God did for Israel and what Israel was called to do, we see this blessing for the nations. And even in that passage, right in the middle of that passage on Jethro, you have the words of commissioning for the call of Israel as a chosen people, as a special treasure above all, to be a nation set apart as priests for all the other nations of the world, to be there, to be a blessing, to support all the nations of the world, to bear witness to all the nations of the world, to represent the maker of heaven and earth to all the nations of the world, and also to represent the nations of all the earth to the maker of heaven and the earth through prayer and intercession and worship in the temple. What Israel's worship was not just for the sake of Israel, but for the whole world. So there's this sense of Israel's call to be a blessing, but there's also something here that I think is also reflected in God's purposes of bringing Jew and Gentile together in Messiah as one new man, and that is the idea of mutuality, that it's not a one-way street. It's not just about Israel being a blessing, but also the nations being a blessing right back. And there's this part of the story with Jethro after they're eating, and then what happens? He's hanging around watching what's going on, and he sees Moses standing from dawn till dusk with this huge line of people waiting to talk to him as he gave them counsel and judged the people and instructed them in the way of the Lord. And what does Jethro say to his son-in-law? He said, "Lo tov." He said, "That's not good. Yeah, let's look at that." Oh yes, things falling out of my Bible. Thank you. He says, "What you're doing is not good." And then he goes on to say, verse 18:17, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing you're doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." And so he instructs him, look, choose leaders that you can delegate to deal with matters that are not so difficult, and the really, really big decisions, the Supreme Court kind of decisions, you can handle, but the lower court decisions we can delegate to other people. But I think there's a principle here, is that it's a Gentile who has a wisdom that Moses didn't have. I mean, Moses, very, very wise, able to discern this is what God says and so on and so forth. But in this one thing, Moses was deficient, and it was his father-in-law, who I think in some ways is a representative of the nations, who gives him a wisdom he didn't have and makes everything just function so much better, not just for Moses, but for the people. So the blessing is going in two directions, you see. Jethro sees Israel, and it bears witness to the supremacy of God over all other gods. It points Jethro on the right track of who he should worship and what is the truth. But at the same time, in that people of God, they rely on the wisdom of those from the nations to help them do what God called them to do in the first place. And you see many, many examples of this. I think Chaim mentioned, and we talked about this before, when Solomon built the temple, he needed the skill and the wisdom of Hiram and the people from Lebanon to get the job done. So this sense of mutual blessing back and forth, you see it over and over and over again in God's wisdom to bring together two into one. Because as Jethro said, you cannot do it alone. And I think this is a word for all of us. As the Jewish people, we cannot do it alone. And as God's people in the nations as well, you cannot do it alone. We need each other. Amen. We complement each other. The blessings go back and forth. And it's kind of an irony, Israel doesn't come into the illumination that they so need until the Gentiles come into their fullness. But in a way, God's at work among the Jewish people and his people in the nations. It's kind of converging lines, because we will never get to the final place where God has called us without the Jewish people. We need each other. We were made for each other. And we see this throughout the parashah and everywhere else in the scriptures. I mean, once you start seeing this, you'll see it everywhere. It's as I said way back when, if you remember, this is all based on the foundation of the relationship between the Father and the Son, because that is a relationship of mutuality. The Son obeys the Father. The Father is blessed by the Son's obedience and bestows on the Son all things. And that just fills the Son with gratitude. And then he just wants to obey and obey and obey his Father. The blessings just continue back and forth between Father and Son for all eternity. All this principle of mutuality we see even here in this parasha, its foundation is the relationship between the Father and the Son. So that's why you're going to see it everywhere. Okay.